Hello and welcome to another inspiring episode of Mtumweni Show, where we explore remarkable stories that inspire and educate audience worldwide. I'm your host, Iddi Mtumweni, and today we have a very special guest who has dedicated her life to preserving and sharing an incredible legacy. Our guest today is Andrea Emily Stumpf, the great-great-granddaughter of Sayyida Salme of Zanzibar, also known as Emily Ruete. Andrea has worked passionately to retranslate and republish memoir of the Arabian Princess to ensure that her ancestor voice and story remain authentic. She has also published Letter to the Homeland and the Centennial collection, deepening our understanding of Sayyida Salme's lives and legacy. We will be discussing Andrea's journey, what inspired her to revisit and translate these works, and her own experience when she visited Zanzibar, the birthplace of her great-great-grandmother. This is a story that connects history, culture, and personal discovery. So without further ado, let's welcome Andrea to the show.
Thank you so much, Iddi. I'm so excited to be here and really excited to be connecting with your audience and to have opportunity to talk really about the Zanzibari roots of my great-great-grandmother and what that just amazing history is all about. Thank you for having me today.
We're happy you're here with us. I have to ask first, what led you to take on the project of retranslating memoir of an Arabian princess?
Yeah, I guess that's a good place to begin. It's been a very significant part of my journey to be able to kind of reach back in history and connect with the writings from my great-great-grandmother. It really began as a personal project. And it's really nice to be able to tell you that I started right after our trip to Zanzibar, which is all the way back in 1998. So got very inspired about all that history, visiting Zanzibar. And I had this feeling I wanted to get to know my ancestor better. I really wanted to find out, who is this very special person in my background? And I thought the best way to get close to her was to really get inside of her words. I was so fortunate. We're also fortunate that she left those writings for us. So I just sat down, and I'm not a translator. I'm a lawyer, so I work with words all the time, but translating is a different exercise. I just thought, let's see how it goes. Let me see what I discover. And that was in 2000 where I really began. And I translated about a third of her memoirs from German into English. And then I stopped and I just got so busy. And I had a child and I was very busy at work and life continued. And it wasn't until 2021, during the pandemic, when I thought, wow, okay, maybe I have a moment now. Maybe I have some time. And I looked for the file. I found it from 20 years before. And I just picked up exactly where I'd left off. And I was just as inspired as I had been originally. And it just felt like it was almost a game for me. It was like a puzzle, like a crossword puzzle, figure out the right word and the right place and the right meaning, the right context. So I just kept on going to the end. And when I finished, only then did I go back and look at some of the older translations, because I hadn't want to be affected by what the old translations looked like. And at that point, I was astonished, particularly one of them, the family authorized, is really quite good, maybe a little sloppy. It has, some things that are left out. It's also very 19th century in the way it's written. But the other one from 1907 from Lionel Strachey was just awful. I mean, it wasn't hers. He had dropped chapters, merged chapters. He'd added subheadings that weren't hers. They were just his ideas of what the highlights were, put in photos, some of which had nothing to do with anything. And I thought, wow, I have got to publish this now. I really felt motivated to essentially rescue her voice. So starting as a personal project, it became much more of a mission on my part to not only create a new level of accuracy in terms of the translation, but also make it very accessible. Globally, English is such an important language, to take the German into English, but also put it in an ebook, put it in an audiobook. I really felt, which should be 21st century kind of language that we're all used to, I felt I had a role to play in terms of putting it out. And it's very similar to what she did when she wrote the memoirs. She wrote them first for her children because she was so badly off. She really didn't know if she would last. And she says in her memoirs, well, actually she says later in her letters, but about the memoirs, that she wrote them to make sure her children would know, but was only later persuaded to then publish them for public consumption, essentially to educate the public about Zanzibar and about the Orient and to correct misconceptions. So that's a long answer to your question, but a lot of motivations flowed into this project, and it's been really wonderful.
Nice. Amazing. I'm glad you mentioned that it was more like intended for the family-based memoir only, for the family to read it and know their mother, their grandmother, and their great-great-grandmother like you. And you felt that way. You see, because when you saw the script, you said, okay, this script was intended for us, and what is out there, it is not what she intended to publish. So what was like for you to uncover and work with Sayyida Salme's writing? Did you feel like personal connection to her through this process of translating?
Yes, I really did. But I wouldn't say it's because she's necessarily my ancestor. I think it's the way that she writes. She's very frank, she's very direct and honest. And she says, I'm going to tell you what I think. You may not like it. It may not be politically correct, is the word we would use today, but I'll be direct with you. I'll give you my kind of authentic views, my observations. And so I feel like anyone who reads her writings will feel a direct connection to her. She's really speaking to us. And in that sense, it's really wonderful to have her voice carry over all the decades and generations, almost centuries even, and still be very relevant and very kind of clear to us in terms of things that we're experiencing today.
Good. That's nice. You mentioned earlier some of the error or misinterpretation that you found, the picture that were placed on the book, on the chapter that has nothing to do with the chapter itself, the chapter that was omitted. What was other thing that missing in the previous version, and how did you and your mother work to restore her voice accurately?
Yeah, so first let me say, since you mentioned my mother, she was actually very critical in this project. And one of the reasons when I picked it up during the pandemic to see how far I could go, I was very motivated to do it like right then and there. My mother's in her late 80s. You never know what can happen. And I knew she would be a fabulous partner for this, so I did not want to delay any further. So I really made sure I was very, very focused on getting it done. And so I published the memoirs in 2022. And 1 year later, I published the letters to the Homeland, the translation in 2023. And just last December, in her 100th anniversary since her death, so she died in 1924. So 2024, I was under the gun, right? I had to finish before the end of the year. But in December, I published the Centennial collection, which has a couple more shorter translations from her. So, I just knew I needed to, give it my attention so that my mother could work with me. And she was absolutely wonderful in terms of quality control and reviewing what I had written. She grew up in Germany. German is, of course, her very strong language. I grew up speaking German, but English is my very strong language. So by the time you put the two together, it was all about accuracy and really respect, to be very sensitive to the context. So that was really a big part of how I went about the project. But I think to go further, it's been very interesting to think about her voice in the 21st century, even though she wrote in the 19th century. And I'd say today we have very different standards of translation. Like, I think what was being done in the 19th century, some of the translating is very nice, but it's just a different quality standard. So I felt there was a mission there to just be much more true to her setting and her voice. And since you mentioned the photos, the images, she put no images in her memoirs, right? There were no photos, no other images. So it's actually one of the things I could contribute now. So if you look at my editions, they are full of photos and images and documents, and some of Zanzibar and some of the Sultanate, and many wonderful photos that we have historically. So I could add them, but I tried to do it with sensitivity so that they're really relevant. I'll give the example of Lionel Strachey. It's one of the worst photos in there. He put in a photo of 3 women from the harem, 3 of the Surya, and it's so clear that it's completely staged. These are not actual Surya, and anyone who is Muslim will appreciate, especially from that time, they have no sleeves, right? They're sleeveless dresses. They have these almost absurd masks that they're wearing, face masks. It's almost an insult. And I say that partly because when Sayyida Salme wrote the memoirs and then decided to publish them, it was partly because she was acutely aware, living in the West, living in Germany at the time, of the just misperceptions, caricatures, stereotypes that the Europeans had of the East, Arabs, more broadly the East, Zanzibaris. And she really had a desire to speak against that, to talk about women's rights, to talk about the beauty of the culture, the importance of the religious ceremonies, the connection to, her maker and creator. She was Christian by then, but she wanted to really reveal the richness of Oriental culture to a European audience that really was looking at the Orient as in very simplistic and actually colonial terms at the time. So to see a photo like what I just described in the Lionel Strachey edition, in a context where she was actually trying to give honor and respect and credibility to the Oriental woman, just goes to the point. It wasn't even just kind of mistaken. It was actually insulting, I think, to see that. But back then, there were also no real standards of copyright. So he could do what he wanted. He picked it up and he kind of made his own creation of it, rather than giving true respect to her voice. And I guess I will say that about myself as well. I know I'm doing the interview with you, so it may look like I'm, the central focus, but what I actually really want is for the focus to be on her. She is the voice, and she is the person who I think we can get to know. So I'm just the bridge. I'm just the conduit to help people see her and hear her and experience her life and learn from her as I think she would have wanted.
Nice. And we're all glad that you're here as a bridge that connect us with Princess Salme. And the version that you're talking about is I think that's the most famous version of the memoir. Even the title, I remember when we discussed earlier, even the title is The Memoir of an Arabian Princess of Zanzibar. And you correct me, you say there is no of Zanzibar, there is just Memoir of an Arabian Princess. So yeah, the era starts from the cover book itself. For those just joining us, we're speaking with Andrea Emily Stumpf, the great-great-granddaughter of Sayyida Salme of Zanzibar. We are diving into her journey of preserving and translating her ancestor memoir and other writing. We will discuss what drove Andrea to publish 2 additional books, later to the Homeland and the Centennial collection, and explore the theme of this important work. Please stay with us. Andrea, you mentioned that you had to publish something on 2024 to mark her 100 years anniversary of her death. After retranslating Memoir of Arabian Princess, you published Letter to the Homeland and the Centennial collection. What inspired you to continue expanding on Sayyida Salme's story?
Well, I guess I should say I'm still inspired, so I'm still adding. It hasn't stopped. But it's been such a wonderful journey, and maybe to just look at what she wrote. Of course, we've talked about the Memoirs of an Arabian Princess. So she wrote Memoiren einer arabischen Prinzessin, which is the German title. And that was an incredible accomplishment. She was the first Arab woman ever to publish a book. Now, I don't know that I can get historians to say that, and I ask a lot of historians, but no one has ever told me anyone that was earlier, so I will keep saying that until someone corrects me. But it's also, if I can digress for just a moment, it's also not, in some ways it's not too incredible when you think about her past and how she got there. We haven't really talked about her own life very much, but one of the things that I think your Zanzibari audience in particular will appreciate is that she quite amazingly taught herself to write in Arabic when she was a child. So she was a princess growing up in the Sultan's household, and the children were being taught to read and write, but only the boys were taught to write, not the girls. And they were reciting from the Quran, so I'm not sure how much they were reading as opposed to reciting. But she, being, very curious, and I think also probably quite intelligent, decided if the boys can do it, probably said to herself, I think I can too. So she took homemade ink on a shoulder blade of a camel, and just tried it out and succeeded. So already, in a way, her literary persona already, you can see it in that she taught herself to write. And it goes even further back. Her mother, who was a Surya, which is the word for concubine, in the harem, so basically a slave who had been purchased into the harem, or we think maybe she was gifted, because unusually she joined the harem when she was very young. The norm, of course, is you bring a concubine in when they're, a woman, when they're at least in their teens, if not older. She was probably 5 or 6, maybe 7, when she joined the concubine. She lost her first tooth there, and obviously still a child. So she sat with all the princes and princesses in the classroom as a child, and very unusually for a Surya, learned how to read. So none of the other Surya none of the Surari is the plural word, were able to read, but she already knew how to read, and she would read the Quran and take the Quran to visit people who were sick and share with them the messages from Allah. And that's how Sayyida Salme grew up, with a literate mother, so it's not too surprising that she became a very literate daughter and ended up being the first Arab woman to publish a book. But anyhow, that was a digression. The memoirs came out in 1886. In the years after that, she wrote a manuscript called Briefe nach der Heimat, which is translated Letters to the Homeland. And really important to think about, she did not share that with anyone, not even her children. And they discovered it posthumously after her death and were probably very shocked to read it. They were very shocked, their letters that they exchange. And it's about her early years. She went from Zanzibar to Germany, and that's a whole story. But she ended up in Germany, and it's about her early years in Germany and how incredibly difficult they were. And this account has not received very much attention, and I think My Letters to the Homeland is the first book that's really paperback and easy to acquire, but is fascinating in its own right. It's not edited, right? Unlike the Memoirs to a Princess, which went through a publishing company and had, multiple editions that were published. This one was essentially, she was writing to herself. We don't know if she planned to try to publish it. The family did try to publish it, but they didn't find a publisher at the time, so it just kind of stayed in the record without getting a lot of exposure. And it is a very raw account of her life in Germany. It is raw and real. And I just kind of knew I had to keep going, right? The Memoirs is only a piece of her story. So I also wanted to share the German part of her life and how difficult that was. And each book is rich and rewarding to read, but then when you put the two side by side, it's even more of a story. One is very light, and it talks about, largely a very positive childhood in Zanzibar, and the other is dark. She really had tragedy and trauma and very difficult times and essentially descended into poverty during her time in Germany, trying to raise 3 children, and she'd lost her husband. So that's part of the tragedy, that he had died. I should tell more of the story here, but I hope your listeners will actually decide to read the originals and learn the story there. So I knew I had to do the letters as well. That was just really an important part too. And then with the Centennial, I wanted to do something for the 100-year anniversary as well. And she had 2 shorter descriptions that I was able to translate. One of them is very short, but it's about her life in Beirut, which came after her time in Zanzibar and Germany, and is also fascinating. She doesn't write very much about it. I kind of used that short piece as an excuse to write a little bit more. But almost a third of her life was spent in Beirut, which, if you look at the lifespan, is quite remarkable, and again, maybe not too surprising, because Zanzibar was hard. She didn't really fit in the box. Germany was hard. She also didn't really fit there. But Beirut, I think she actually felt a bit more of a fit. It was a very cosmopolitan place at the time. Arab was the homegrown language. Many Muslims. She was Christian by then, but there were also many Christians in Beirut. So she had much more of a chance to be herself in a place like Beirut. So I think for me, part of the mission in this 3-book series was to present all these different aspects of her. And if readers are interested, they can reflect on these different places that she lived in and how they affected her and how they affected her kind of understanding of society, which is part of what is really interesting for us to think about and to learn from.
It's so rare to find somebody who talk about their ancestor in a way that you describe her here, especially if there is a book that give us a little bit about her, the memoir of an Arabian princess that was previous published. And now there is a lot that we don't know. There is a lot that we need to know about her, because the memoir only is not telling the story that you explain here, from the letter to the Homeland and the Centennial collection. This is the must-read book for all people who love history, especially the history of East Africa. We're talking about Princess Salme here, the Princess of Zanzibar. Beyond her personal story, Sayyida Salma becomes a significant figure in Arab and women's studies. Like you mentioned here today, that she was the first Arab to publish a book, although we're waiting for any other historian to challenge that. But for now, we will roll with that. How do you see her legacy impacting modern discussion in today's topic,
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question, because so much of my focus has been on her and her life. But in fact, what she brings us is a very just wonderful picture of Zanzibar, particularly in the memoirs, and a very rich description of the culture and the lifestyle and the customs, traditions, and also some historical stories. She describes in great detail and almost like a thriller. She describes the coup attempt that Said Bargash tried on Said Majid, which of course failed, and she was on the wrong side. And that, of course, made life very difficult for her in Zanzibar, and may have been, it's not hard to connect the dots, may have been one of the reasons that she felt an alternative might be a good idea. But if you look at the memoirs, I really believe this is a national treasure of Zanzibar. It is a way for Zanzibaris and anyone interested in Zanzibar or that part of history or that part of the world to connect into an incredible time in Zanzibar. I can tell you, the way I grew up here learning history in the United States, nobody taught me about East Africa. I mean, you can hardly imagine that a country, a nation, a city really, Muscat, had so much power through trade and through its seafaring activities that it got control of the east coast of Africa all the way down to Zanzibar, and then ruled Zanzibar, I think, in a way that, I think Said was an amazing statesman. He was quite incredible in how he was able to make that a prosperous island and create commercial success. So I think going into that history is very eye-opening. I have a tag on my website, and in my books, I basically say, let history surprise you, let her story inspire you, let her authentic voice speak to you. But it starts with this surprising history that is really, if you go to Zanzibar today, it's really important to understand what Zanzibar was in the 19th century. The good and the bad, right? We can also talk about the slavery. We can talk about the ivory trade. We can talk about many things. We can talk about the colonialism. The role the Arabs played, the roles the British and the French and the German played. There's so much history there to unpack. But I think if we hadn't had her writings, 90% of that history would be lost. We would not know what it was like in the harem, in the Sultanate household. We would not know all the stories of that history, that tradition. She has a chapter that she devotes to each of the Islamic festivals. She describes the medicine, how diseases were handled. She describes the daily schedule, the horseback riding they did, how they cooked their food. There's so many. She's an ethnographer, really. And I can only imagine that, particularly when a Zanzibari audience reads her memoirs, that there are many points in which they connect directly to the history that Zanzibaris know themselves.
In my years of reading books, I have never found a book that described the Zanzibari life back then, especially in the Sultanate household, Beit Mtoni, Beit Sahel, and all the Sultanate household. I mean, Sayyida Salme will describe the food, the daily food, and what time they eat, how they arrange, like the dining arrangement with the Sultan. That is amazing. It's truly amazing, and I hope maybe the upcoming project will see the real life movie of Sayyida Salme, with maybe some huge studio will put this amazing memoir in a movie, so we can experience visually, because it's so easy how she described it for the filmmaker to be able to portray that, because she didn't leave any details about her life back in Zanzibar. If you are joining us we've been exploring the incredible journey of Andrea Emily Stumpf. Has she honored the life and legacy of Sayyida Salme, her great-great-grandmother? We've learned about the translation process and the deep personal connection Andrea herself feels to her ancestors' work. And we will talk Andrea's personal experience visiting Zanzibar and what is made for her to walk in Sayyida Salme's footsteps. Please stay with us. Andrea, you personally visited Zanzibar, the birthplace of Sayyida Salme. Can you share what experience was like for you? Did it give you new perspective on her journey? Because you know her through the memoir, through some of the manuscript, and now you had a chance to visit her birthplace, to visit most of the thing that she described on the memoir happened in Zanzibar.
Yeah, I don't know if your listeners can even, or watchers, viewers can even imagine this, but this was 1997. Of course, that's before the internet, even before email, or email was just starting to happen. I don't know. We had this idea, and it was actually my father. You know, I'm descended through all the women, so my mother is the great-granddaughter, and then there's me. But my father was always very interested in the history as well. And he was going to be traveling to Egypt, and I had a trip for my work to India. And he was just like, well, why don't we go visit Zanzibar? You know, we'll just meet. And I thought, what a great idea. We should try. But nobody was visiting Zanzibar at the time. I think Zanzibar was still, a fairly closed environment, even, after the revolution then and into many years, particularly towards, let's say, an Arab connection. So I didn't have any place to go. I didn't know how to figure out how to get to Zanzibar. And I was working in New York at the time. I ended up calling the Tanzanian mission to the United Nations because I was like the best I could do. There was no place else to go. No travel agency was going to tell me how to get there. So I just cold call. I'm just like, hello, I'm trying to get to Zanzibar. How can I do this? Can you give me some advice? So I was really fortunate that the person who answered the phone happened to be from Zanzibar. So this is the Tanzanian mission, but it was someone from Zanzibar. And at the very end of the call, after he gave me some very helpful advice, I just happened to mention why we were hoping to go to Zanzibar. Of course, you can imagine he got very excited and was very encouraging. And then I hung up and we made our plans and we were like getting ready to go. Unbeknownst to me, he had gone back to Zanzibar, his colleagues in Zanzibar, and let them know that we were planning this trip. And it turns out they planned an entire visit where we arrived and there was a welcoming party at the port. And they took us in a van and they basically handed us a program for the next week. And they had scheduled a concert and a dance and visits with ministers. And there was even a state lunch with the President Amour at the time. And, we're just normal people, right? So we were like, whoa, we didn't know what to do. We were even on the evening news every night telling people what we'd done that day. And the reason was, I think not so much for us, but for her, right? There was this growing interest in tourism. And I think she was seen as potentially an element as a tourist draw. And I think it's true. I see it today. You know, there are ways in which people connect to Zanzibar through her, that she is maybe part of the tourism. Certainly back then, there was this idea that if we publicize Sayyida Salme and do it through family and on the news, we will raise awareness and perhaps that will generate some interest. So you can tell me better because you're there, or, you know, your viewers are in Zanzibar, as to, you know, whether that vision has come to pass. And I also think, you know, tourism is wonderful, but at the same time, you want to preserve your traditions and the beauty of Stone Town and all those historical roots and keep it in its original quality, not let it become too westernized. But in that sense, yes, it was an amazing trip. I am way overdue to go back to Zanzibar. Have not been back since then. I know it has changed a lot. Maybe I should even mention somewhat tactfully, if people are noticing what's behind me on the wall. I don't think I could get them today, but back then there really were no tourists. And those are, of course, wood beams from the Zanzibari doors. And was quite incredible what we saw. And I have had these on my wall and cherished them, you know, for almost 30 years now. That has really been wonderful as a remembrance of that visit. So I think the connection of Sayyida Salme as a way to share Zanzibar with the world is real, and I hope that my books contribute to that. And I will also mention that even though today, you know, you go and you might visit Beit Mtoni and some of the other places, I think some of those are now increasingly in disrepair, so I hope that they can be restored. But even in Sayyida Salme's time, so her trip in 1885, the year before she published her memoirs, and she describes it, it's the last chapter in her memoirs, was her return to Zanzibar, which was, of course, incredibly emotional for her, just this incredible opportunity to connect back with her land and her people. She describes visiting Beit Mtoni, where she was born, and being shocked at how overgrown and broken down it was. And so I think for Zanzibaris, probably also a very moving description, because it already then, in more than 100 years ago, had fallen into disuse and disrepair. So there's a lot of history there, but a lot of history to preserve and to remember and to, keep alive as much as possible for that history to keep having a presence and reminding us of those times in Zanzibar in the 19th century. So I mentioned that we were invited to this state lunch, which was a great honor, something we did not expect at all. But it was wonderful. And we arrived, and there's a very, very large table, and a lot of people seated around the table. But when we arrived, we were seated right away, and we didn't really have a chance to find out who was at the table. A lot of important people. And I was, wanting to hold on to the moment. So I took my little notebook where I had been taking all my notes during the trip, and I sent it around the table. And I asked everyone to sign so that I could have a record who was there. And so when the notebook came back to me, I leaned over to the person that was next to me, and I was like, okay, so here are all the names, who are we looking at? And so they went through and they kind of told us a few, and then they said, these are your relatives. And I said, what? My relatives? And I look across the table, and there was, I think it was 4 individuals were seated on the other side of the table. They had not been introduced to us before, but of course we made sure to meet them afterwards. And it turns out that, I'm not going to remember exactly which sultan, but it turns out that they were children of one of the sultans from, I think maybe grandchildren of the sultan. I'm getting it all wrong, I'm sure. But what was remarkable to me is they were as African could be. And I mean that in terms of skin color as well. You know, I'm obviously totally white. They were very African black. And it was quite a stunning moment for us to be side by side and to know that we were connected as family through this history. And even more incredible to hear, because we were wondering, why are you the relatives that are here at the table? You know, are there others here? And of course, with the revolution, you know, many had left, and it turns out they had stayed partly because they were the African part of the family and had had an African mother. So I just thought that was quite revealing in terms of the circumstances of history, that we would have that opportunity to be at the table together in celebration of Sayyida Salme, that we would know each other as family, and that through the quirks and circumstances, some of them, you know, tragic and violent, that we, you know, that history had shaped our trajectories in such different ways, and that they were still there as family, whereas they were the only ones still there as the children of the Sultanate. Now, I don't know, I have no contact with them. I don't know if they're still alive, if they remember, if they are, you know, perhaps even able to listen to this. But that was an amazing moment when we discovered each other around that table and could look back in history in terms of how we'd each gotten there.
And that's the beauty of Zanzibar Island and the people. No matter what happened, what happened on the history, on the past, there is still the connection of the people, the remarkable hospitality, and it's so rare to find, to see how people live together and how they share the culture and the history together. I'm glad I'm hoping so many Zanzibarians who flee the country in one way or another around the world will be able to see it and think, okay, I gotta go back to Zanzibar. I have to visit Zanzibar, because the way you expect is not, it's gonna be like beyond your expectation how well you will be welcomed there. Like we say, welcome to Zanzibar, Hakuna Matata, no worry. Zanzibar, like I say, holds such a rich history, and your great-great-grandmother was part of it. I mean, you cannot mention the history of Zanzibar without mentioning her remarkable story, because she was the princess, the favorite daughter of Said bin Sultan. What do you think? I mean, the favorite was Sayyida Salme, like she mentioned in.
I was just going to correct you.
I remember, yeah, like she mentioned in her memoir. Like they mentioned in her memoir.
But he had his favorites. It's really true.
Yes. What do you think she has to say to Zanzibaris today?
Well, actually, it's very interesting that you would characterize it in the context of what I would say is this incredible mix of cultures and languages and other pieces. Like when you go to Zanzibar, you actually see it on the faces of the people. It is so present, and it is part of that history. And I think Sultan Said bin Sultan, so her father, he was emblematic for that kind of tolerance. I mean, what he built up in terms of being this kind of trading hub and we can talk, it's much more complex, right? I don't mean to oversimplify it. It was a very hierarchical society. There was a huge amount of slave trade. It was very, very tragic in many, ways. But it was also a prosperous time, and he had much tolerance for people from India, people from European cultures, different religions. There was a level of tolerance which was probably very unusual for the time, even in the midst of all the slavery and hierarchy that was taking place. Part of the rich discussion that we can have about all of this. But what Sayyida Salme brings to the table, which is so unique and special, is that she embodied this East-West perspective. She grew up in the East, in the Orient, and then she ended up in the West, in Germany, and had dealings with the British, and in a way, like within her own person, was seeing the East and the West at the same time. So when she speaks to us, she's not speaking just from one perspective or the other. She's got this mix, and she's actually writing about the kind of the way they intersect and collide with each other, these two cultures. And sometimes she's actually really funny about it. She's like, I just wonder why Germans spend so much time cleaning their floors instead of cleaning their bodies. They should spend more time in the bathtub than, so, I mean, these observations, or, how when she was growing up in Zanzibar, she had to basically wear like a burqa. She was completely covered whenever she was in public, could not expose her face or anything. And then she gets to Europe, and these women have these, shirts that are down to here, and it's all, the European fashion. And she's just like, my God, the one is extreme in one direction and the other is extreme in the other direction, So we can read what she writes and get this dual prism, get this dual perspective, which is actually really informative, And back then it was even more kind of extreme. Today we're sort of used to all this multicultural stuff, but in her time, very strong differences and a lot of borders and boundaries as to what you could do and how you could behave. So it's that kind of duality in her life, even in her name. We have Sayyida Salme, Emily Ruete, and then, of course, in her writings, that we can experience what it means to be this kind of a multicultural society, and how much we can keep striving for it today.
That's very true, and I'm sure for the Zanzibaris themselves, they know how important Sayyida Salme is in the history of Zanzibar. Like you can see, there is a special museum dedicated on her, that telling the story of Sayyida Salme, and in some way we will invite the organizer of the museum to see the story on their side. Why do they decide to start a museum, and what is that museum means to Zanzibaris themselves. Before we finish our discussion today,
may I just say that is, I think you're referring to the Princess Salme Museum, who was founded by Sayyida
yes.
And he was actually very influential. He did an important exhibit in 2001 in London at the SOAS, which was, I think, the first major exhibit on Sayyida Salme, and he has certainly devoted much of his life to sharing her story, to making it visible, and it's very fitting. It's great that he's in Zanzibar, creating that platform for tourists and others to get to know her through his. So I'm sure he has a lot that he can share with you as well.
Yeah, I need to see the perspective of his museum and the people who visited the museum and what they have to say about Sayyida Salme, and that how we will get to know the real impact of Sayyida Salme's story on Zanzibaris' life. before we go, I need to read the last page, the very last page of Sayyida Salme memoir, the version that we talk about, and I already booked your version because I really need to see to read the letter to the Homeland and the memoir on your translation, so I can, like you say, I can compile and see the similarity and the difference between these two translation. This is the conclusion. It is the conclusion. The letter she received from one of her friends when she visited Zanzibar, and she didn't get a chance to say goodbye to them. I think you're aware of what I'm referring here. Yeah, it's some kind of poetic, and if there is any way we can know who wrote this letter to her, maybe we can uncover more of the story, because it's so touching, it's so poetic itself. I mean, maybe there is other collection of this kind of letter that was sent to Sayyida Salme from Zanzibari to German. I'm gonna read it in Swahili, so my Swahili audience will know what I'm referring to. So it's
well, and actually, Iddi, let's just say it was written in Arabic.
Okay.
Right? So the original reached her in Arabic, and I think your question is very, very interesting. I don't think we know who actually wrote it. I don't even know if we have the original, but we have an Arabic version that her daughter transcribed. She published it in German because her memoirs were published in German originally. I have translated it into English. There are other translations, but it's pretty idiomatic from the Arab to the English. So I think I tried to improve on that a bit. But now you'll be reading it in Swahili, which just really speaks to the topic, right? And Swahili was her mother tongue. She, of course, spoke Arabic. That's the language of the Sultanate. But everybody was comfortable with Swahili, and that was her language with her husband. They spoke to each other in Swahili, so it's very fitting. I didn't know there was a Swahili translation of this, but
okay.
Please go ahead.
I have to
It's
say,
wonderful.
there is no Swahili translation like formal. I just Google translate this.
It's wonderful. Go for it. I love it.
I hope
That's
I'm
what
not
I
gonna,
did. I
hope I'm not
right?
gonna mess this up. So he say, waliondoka bila kunambia kuwa walikuwa wakienda. Hilo lilirarua moyo wangu na kujaza nafsi yangu moto uteketezao. Ya laiti ningewashikilia kwa nguvu shingoni walipoondoka, maana wangeketi juu ya kichwa changu na kutembea juu ya macho yangu. Wanakaa moyoni mwangu na waliondoka, waliumiza roho yangu kama haijawahi kuumizwa hapo awali. Mwili wangu unadhoofika na machungu yangu yanatiririka bila kukoma. Moja baada ya jingine yanatekeleza mashavuni mwangu kama mawimbi ya bahari. Bwana wa ulimwengu, tulete pamoja kabla hatujafa. Hata kama ni kwa siku chache tu kabla. Tukiwa hai tutakutana tena. Na tutakapokufa sehemu yetu isokufa itadumu milele. Ya laiti ningekuwa ndege, ningepaa kwa shauku kuwafuata. Lakini ndege atawezaje kuruka ikiwa mabawa yake yamekatwa? Oh my God, that's the last part. He say, that I were a bird, then I will longly soar away after them. But how can a bird fly whose wings are clipped? So it's basically poems. The way she explained it, she described it in a poetic way. And I'm sure Princess Salme received many later, but she decided to include this one in her memoir. And I think we know why. So this is how Zanzibari felt when Princess Salme visited Zanzibar and left again for the second time.
Yeah, so this was after her 1885 trip, after she had fled the island in 1867, basically to save her life and the life of her child, who was, not yet born. And of course, such an important visit. But, it's so wonderful to hear the Swahili, to hear you read it. And Iddi, I don't know how you feel about this. I've talked for a long time. I feel like this is actually where we should end the interview, because I would love to end on her voice. And her voice in Swahili, I really think she would be so pleased to know that, you have picked up on these lines and spoken them in her mother tongue. And I should stop. There's nothing I can add. I think this is where we end.
Andrea,
I hope your readers discover these words directly and, let her speak to them. And I have a blog where I try to also talk about her relevance to today, and I would welcome anyone reaching out if they find ways in which Sayyida Salme is speaking to them today. So sayyidasalme.com. But yeah, I meant to give her the last word, so let me go back to that. Thank you.
Yeah, Andrea, this has been absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your journey, the work that you have done, preserve your great-great-grandmother legacy, and personal insight you have gained along the way. Sayyida Salme's stories is one of the resilience, bravery, and breaking boundary. A story that continues to inspire generation, and thanks to you, thanks to your dedication, we can understand her life in a deeper and more authentic way through this translation. To our listener, if you like to read Memoir of an Arabian Princess, Letter to the Homeland, and the Centennial collection, we will share in the detail on this episode description, where you can go and buy this book and follow Andrea's blog so you can learn more. Thank you for tuning in this Mtumweni Show today. Until next time, please keep exploring the story that shape our world. I'm your host, Iddi Mtumweni. See you soon.